Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm back with another case after a very brief break from YouTube. I do apologise for sort of disappearing on you guys, but I'm back now and I'm back bombarding you with loads of really interesting cases. So for today's case, we're going to be discussing a pair called Loeb and Leopold. They were a young pair of men who ended up carrying out a murder because they believed essentially that they were going to be able to commit the perfect crime, and the whole thing is really twisted and fascinating, so I just thought it'd be an interesting one to come back with. So yeah, I hope you guys find this interesting and we shall just get started. Nathaniel Leopold Jr. was born on November the 19th in the year of 1904, and Richard Albert Loeb was born on June the 11th in 1905, both in Chicago, Illinois. The pair are often referred to commonly as Loeb and Leopold. Nathaniel Leopold was born into a well-off German family and was claimed as being an abnormally intelligent child from a very young age. According to his family, Leopold spoke his first words at just 4 months old. When he was 18, he started studying at the University of Chicago with the goals of travelling for a year after his graduation before then continuing his studies at the Harvard Law School. His alleged impressive intelligence is further supported by his claims of having the ability to fluently speak 5 different languages as well as learning a total of 15 languages. Richard Loeb, much like Leopold, was extremely intelligent himself. He was able to skip multiple years in his early school life as a result of his exceptional abilities, and he graduated from the University of Michigan with his degree at just 17 years old. His focus was not entirely on academics as Leopold had been, as he was more inclined to spend his free time socialising and taking part in specific athletic activities. The pair had known each other while growing up due to the fact that they both lived in the Kenwood neighbourhood of Chicago. The Loeb family's impressive house was 2 blocks away from where Leopold had grown up, and the pair had been somewhat acquaintances from a young age. However, they didn't become particularly close until they attended university and discovered they both had extensive interests in all things crime related. The pair began their life of crime in a petty sense, carrying out minor criminal acts like vandalism and theft where they saw fit. One incident in particular saw them break into a fraternity house on the university campus in hopes of stealing a significant amount of valuables from the house. However, all they had managed to lift from the house was a total of $80 in cash, a typewriter, a camera, and some penknives amongst other random belongings. As time passed and the pair became more experienced, the severity of their crimes increased. It wasn't long before their petty vandalism turned into arson amongst other accelerated offences, but these happened to go unnoticed at the time. When the pair began to realise that their minor criminal acts weren't actually gaining any public attention, they decided that they were going to plan to commit the perfect crime, as they called it. The pair were obsessed with criminal history and all things crime related, and this extensive knowledge combined with both of their confidence and their intellectual abilities seemed to make a perfect combination for them to carry this out. The act that they had planned on carrying out is now known as the murder of Bobby Franks. Leopold and Loeb were 19 and 18 years old at the time this took place, and they'd spent months planning this perfect crime of theirs with the intention of it never being solved by the authorities. After over 7 months, the pair had managed to meticulously plan out everything. They knew how they were going to go about abducting their victim, as well as the method of killing them, and how and where they were going to dispose of the remains. In order to create and reinforce a motive behind the attack, they decided they would write a ransom note. They'd even thought through all of the details regarding how they were going to collect the demands through a set of intricate instructions for delivery that would be given over the phone. Using the typewriter that they had previously stolen from the university fraternity house, they typed up a set of instructions that detailed where and how the money drop would occur. They had at this point also known that their murder weapon of choice would be a brand new chisel that the pair would buy. The only thing that the pair hadn't previously planned out had been exactly who their victim was going to be. They decided to dedicate a large portion of their time searching for their future victim around the area of the local Harvard School for Boys, which is interestingly where Richard Loeb had actually attended school in his younger years. And it was here that they'd come across a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Franks. Bobby Franks also happened to be Loeb's second cousin who lived just across the road from him, as well as having spent a number of days in his family's house. And then came the day of May the 21st, 1924. Nathaniel Leopold had rented out a car using the pseudonym Morton D. Ballard and drove towards the route that they knew Bobby would take on his walk home from school. The pair pulled up to Bobby and offered to give him a ride home since they knew him and they knew where he lived. But since his home wasn't a far walk from where he was, he decided to refuse the ride home. It was actually Richard Loeb who had managed to convince the young boy to take them up on their offer by asking him about a particular tennis racket he knew the boy had been using when he'd visited his family's residence to play. It is not known exactly what happened to Bobby Franks once he got inside of the car, but it's believed that Leopold had been driving the car and Loeb had been sat in the back seat, meaning that the young boy had sat in the passenger seat of the car. And Loeb had on him the chisel that the pair had just purchased, and once they were all inside of the car, Loeb struck Bobby in the head a number of times using the weapon. He then used all of his strength to pull the boy into the back seat where he was sat, and he gagged him. Before long, Bobby Franks was no longer alive. In order to hide the body away from any passers-by, they decided to hide the body in the footwell of the car and headed to their next planned-out location. They decided they were going to dispose of the body by Wolf Lake in Hammond, Indiana. When it was dark, the pair removed the remains from the car and they also removed their own clothes to be destroyed. They hid the remains in a large culvert, which is a large pathway that kind of is used to pass water through underneath the nearby railroad tracks. And to make the identification of the body even more difficult if authorities were to happen to discover the remains, they poured hydrochloric acid all over his face and his genitals. And from here, they headed straight back to Chicago. News of Bobby Franks' disappearance had already begun to spread as his family were immediately concerned for his safety when he didn't return home from school. The next step in their plan was for Leopold to ring Bobby's mother and use the name George Johnson. They used this name to tell Bobby's mother that her son had been kidnapped and to then give her each of the individual instructions of how to meet their ransom demand. And they also then posted the typed ransom note to her to reinforce this as a proposed motive. They made sure to burn all of the clothes that they had been wearing at the time of the attack and cleaned out what they could from inside the car. And the next morning, the ransom note arrived at the Franks household, and this is when Leopold once again rang them up, informing them of what they needed to do in order for their son to be returned to them. The first issue came about in the plan when a family member of Bobby's had intended on following the instructions for how to meet the ransom demand, but amongst all of the chaos and the panic, they completely forgotten the address. And very shortly after this, their plan completely fell apart when word spread that a local resident had discovered the remains of Bobby Franks. And it was at this point that they began to realise that their plan was starting to fall apart, as their ploy to create the illusion of a kidnapping motive had been completely shattered. In a panic, the pair decided to destroy the typewriter that they had stolen and used to write the ransom demand. They also burned the fabric that they had used to move the remains out of the car following the attack, and they were convinced that they'd done everything that possibly could to cover all traces of having been involved in the boy's death. Following the discovery of the remains, the local police kicked off a detailed investigation in order to find out exactly what had happened to the young boy. Loeb at this point had continued his life as normal, but Leopold actually seemed to love the attention that anyone involved in the case was getting from the media and the police. It had gotten to the extent where he was openly discussing the crime to anyone that would ask him and talking about all the theories he had regarding what could have possibly happened to the boy. In retrospect, one extremely obvious behaviour on behalf of Leopold had occurred while talking to a detective working on the investigation. He had said to him, "If I were to murder anybody, it would be just such a cocky little son of a bitch as Bobby Franks." During an extensive search of the site of where the remains were found, the investigators had come across a pair of glasses. They had little hope in identifying the owner of the glasses through the prescription and the frame, since they both seemed to be particularly common. However, these particular glasses had been fitted with a unique hinge that only 3 people in the whole of Chicago had purchased, and one of these 3 people had been Leopold himself. During the investigations of each of these 3 people, Leopold had suggested to the investigators that he had likely lost his glasses during a bird-watching trip in the area the weekend before the remains were found. And very shortly after this, investigators came across the stolen typewriter that had been thrown in the nearby Jackson Park Lagoon. All of the pieces had started coming together, and both Leopold and Loeb were called in for further questioning towards the end of May. The pair repeatedly told investigators that at the time of Bobby's murder, they had met two women named Edna and May who had taken them up on an offer of a lift in Leopold's car. They never learned of the women's surnames and only knew that they had dropped them off somewhere near a golf course. This had initially seemed like a relatively plausible alibi at the time until they double-checked with Leopold's full-time driver, who said that on the night in question, Leopold's car was being repaired in the garage, so he couldn't have been using it. And this was then supported even further when the driver's wife said that she could confirm that the car was inside Leopold's garage the entire night. As more and more of their plan began to unravel, it didn't take long for Loeb to confess. He maintained the entire time that Leopold had been the one that was the mastermind behind the entire plan, organising everything and actually killing Bobby, whilst Loeb had just been the driver. And once this confession had been gained, Leopold's followed very quickly. However, Leopold maintained that he had been the driver, while Loeb had been the one to mastermind everything and actually carry out the attack. And these confessions, in combination with all of the details that the investigators had kind of collected up until that point, just seemed to really reinforce their guilt. And there is just a lot of discussion regarding who had actually been the one in what role in terms of during the attack, but it'll never really be known for sure. The pair had both made it clear throughout that their aim had not been for anything other than to be able to carry out the perfect crime, as opposed to actually enjoying the crime itself. In terms of the actual trial, Loeb's family hired a man named Clarence Darrow as a criminal defence attorney due to his reputation as being heavily against the death penalty. It was widely assumed that the pair's defence team would attempt to lessen their sentence by pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. However, they decided to enter a guilty plea in an attempt to avoid the death penalty. The trial went on for over a month, and ultimately the two men were found guilty of murder and kidnapping. The murder charge landed them both life imprisonment, while the kidnapping charge added an extra 99 years onto both of their sentences. They were both sent to, I apologise if I mispronounce this, Joliet Prison in Illinois, with the initial intention of preventing the pair from having as much contact from one another while inside as possible, although this attempt failed miserably and the pair remained in regular contact. After a few years, Leopold transferred to Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, and then not long after, Loeb soon joined him. While incarcerated here, the pair made active attempts to try and improve the education system within prisons, which were ultimately successful and led to the inclusion of high school and college level work being taught. And then in January of 1936, when he was just 31 years old, Richard Loeb was attacked and killed by another inmate. This prisoner, James Day, had used a straight razor to attack him while he was in the shower room and remained alive until he was taken to the prison hospital. Now, according to James Day, he had only attacked Loeb as a form of self-defense, as he had been the actual victim of the initial attack, but this seemed like a very unlikely scenario considering Day was left completely unharmed while Loeb had such extensive injuries. It had been concluded that Loeb's throat had been split while the attacker had been stood behind him, and there was also evidence of defensive wounds on his arms. At the time, stories had spread through the public that the attack inside the prison had been the result of Loeb making sexual advances towards Day, which resulted in Day feeling the need to defend himself. And this has caused much debate over the years following regarding whether or not this had been a likely scenario. There were many people, including the chaplain that worked in the prison, Leopold himself, and also some other employees inside the prison, that since argued that it was much more likely that Day had been the one to proposition Loeb as opposed to the reverse. Leopold, on the other hand, seemed to have a slightly more pleasant experience while incarcerated. Since he could already allegedly speak 15 languages, he'd taken the opportunity to learn a further 12 languages. It directly influenced a number of changes inside the prison itself as well, including the changes to the schooling system that I previously mentioned, but also a complete reorganisation of the prison library and the encouragement of volunteer work inside the prison. And then in 1956, a novel called Compulsion was released, written by Maya Levin in cooperation with Leopold himself. It told the story of the murder of Bobby Franks to paint the picture of Leopold having been the victim of a disturbing childhood and an unhealthy relationship with Loeb, and this had allegedly kind of been the reason for him being driven to carry out the attack. and then in March of 1958, Leopold was released from prison. He eventually moved to Puerto Rico, where he soon found himself a wife. He attended classes at the University of Puerto Rico, where he graduated with a master's degree, and he went on to have a number of jobs, including researching leprosy at the university's medical school. And then on August the 29th of the year of 1971, Leopold died aged 66 as a result of a heart attack. And that is where I'm going to end my video today. It's definitely just an interesting one. I never really know how to sort of end these solved ones because they kind of tie themselves up neatly, they answer all the questions. The main questions in regards to this case is it's not really known exactly who played what role during the attack of Bobby Franks, and there's just been a lot of discussion in terms of the nature of the relationship between the two men, so it's definitely worth considering. If you guys want to discuss it, feel free to leave your comments down below. I definitely love seeing your guys' discussions, and yeah, I hope you guys found this interesting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching, bye!